Imagine the ultimate betrayal. Not just a broken heart, but a capital crime against your king, your bloodline, and your God. For centuries, a woman's infidelity was never treated as a private mistake. It was an act of social and spiritual treason. When these accusations flew, justice wasn't an impartial process. It was a terrifying public ceremony delivered with the rope, the stake, the river, and the stone. Societies across continents designed punishments so brutal, they stand as permanent, horrifying warnings, etched into the collective memory. These weren't random acts of fury. They were meticulously constructed systems of control, endorsed by rulers, judges, and religious leaders. This is the harrowing history of how intimate love became a public death sentence. Before we dive into these terrifying details, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into dark history, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Across the Holy Roman Empire, spanning Germany, Austria, and Switzerland between the 13th and 16th centuries, one of the most horrifying fates for women charged with marital misconduct was sack drowning, known as sacung. This method of execution was formally written into many local legal codes and was an accepted, frequent sentence. It was not a private affair but a staged, legal ritual meant to serve as a stark moral example to the public. The 13th century German legal text, Saxenspiegel, codified female adultery as a direct violation of a man's honor and the integrity of his household. While male adulterers usually faced fines or public shame, women were commonly sentenced to lethal physical punishment. The Carolina, the major 1532 criminal code from Emperor Charles V, permitted the execution of adulterous women by drowning, depending on regional traditions. The condemned woman was secured, then tightly sewn inside a weighted sack, often containing heavy stones or even animals like cats or dogs, before being dropped into a local waterway. In cities such as Augsburg and Nuremberg, the ritual was carried out with chilling formality. Citizens and officials looked on as the woman struggled in the enclosed, suffocating darkness, unable to plead, flail, or utter a single scream. Drowning this way was a disorienting, protracted, and absolute end. The body was typically left to drift downstream, maximizing its impact as a warning. Drowning was often favored as a cleaner execution method for women. However, the deliberate ritual of sacung shows that it was fundamentally cruel. The goal was to eliminate the woman's dignity, voice, and very identity. Adulterous women were deemed to contaminate the social structure, and thus they were disposed of silently, like garbage beneath the surface. This penalty highlights the extreme gender bias of medieval justice. The victim was not just killed, but completely obliterated, denied recognition, a proper burial, and silenced in both existence and finality. In late medieval and early modern Europe, public executions by fire were more than just penalties. They were elaborate state-sponsored spectacles designed for moral purification and social control. For women accused of infidelity, especially when combined with allegations of heresy, witchcraft, or unchastity, being burned alive became one of the most savage punishments. The purifying flame, in the authorities' view, was necessary, and the woman's body, for defying moral norms, was considered only fit for incineration. Records from the 14th and 15th centuries across France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire document the burning of women judged guilty of marital betrayal. For instance, Rouen, France, court documents from 1431 show women sentenced to death by fire for broadly defined, immoral conduct. Though infidelity alone wasn't always sufficient for burning, it was often used as a major justification when authorities sought extreme measures. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, an influential manual used in witch trials, directly linked a woman's moral failures to spiritual corruption. If a woman strayed from her husband, especially openly or with someone of a lower class, she was easily branded a threat to social stability. Accusations rapidly escalated. An adulteress might quickly be labeled a heretic, a seductress, or a witch. For such women, fire was the prescribed judgment. The executions took place in the central town square, often on busy market days. The woman was tied to a wooden stake, usually dressed plainly, surrounded by kindling. Crowds gathered to observe and internalize the brutal lesson. A woman's personal behavior belonged to her community and husband, not to herself. Clergy preached, charges were read, and then the fire was set. Burning alive meant a prolonged, agonizing death. Flames first attacked the lower limbs, then moved up. Sometimes, executioners offered a form of mercy by strangling the woman first or using smoke-producing wood. But such relief was never guaranteed. The woman's screams were often overwhelmed by the fire's roar and the noise of the assembled crowd. Imagine a world where the law is carved not in paper, but in monolithic stone. Around 1754 BCE, under the rule of King Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia, one of civilization's first written legal frameworks was codified. This Babylonian code, which now resides in the Louvre Museum after its discovery in Susa, details incredibly harsh and distinctly gendered penalties for moral offenses. Chief among them, a married woman caught in adultery faced a capital sentence, usually death by either public drowning or stoning. Section 129 of this famous code chillingly declares, "If a man's wife is discovered lying with another man, they shall be bound together and thrown into the water." It continues, "If the husband chooses to spare his wife's life, the king, in turn, may spare the life of her lover." This passage reveals two crucial aspects of Babylonian judicial thought: the absolute, uncontested authority a husband held over his spouse's life and destiny, and the expectation that both the unfaithful wife and her partner would be condemned to die. Yet, where the man might sometimes receive a royal pardon or substitution with a fine, the woman's penalty was almost universally lethal. Although drowning was an official prescription, stoning was a widely employed method across Mesopotamian city-states, especially when the punishment demanded the full, collaborative participation of the community. Records and legal commentaries from neighboring empires, like the Assyrians, show that stoning an adulterous woman was seen as a profound act of collective moral purification. The condemned woman was led to the city's perimeter or a central square, stripped of all outward signs of her status and identity, and forced into a pit or secured to a wooden post. Then, the male members of the community, often including the city elders or even her own husband, would hurl stones until she lost consciousness or died from her injuries. The execution was designed to be agonizingly slow, deeply shaming, and utterly symbolic. Stones were chosen precisely because they necessitated sustained, collaborative violence from many individuals, transforming the execution into a shared responsibility. The woman, once a protected member of a family and society, was brutally reduced to a disposable criminal body, destroyed by the very people sworn to protect her. For the Babylonian state, female adultery was far more than a simple betrayal. It represented a cosmic breach of order, and stoning her to death was viewed as the necessary mechanism to restore divine and social equilibrium. There was no jury, no right to appeal. The relentless stones became her final verdict. United States shame as punishment, public pillar and flogging in colonial America. In the 17th and 18th centuries, throughout the Puritan settlements of colonial America, adultery transcended a simple moral transgression. It was codified as a public offense against the entire social order. Colonial law, especially in Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Virginia, heavily relied on Old Testament interpretations, treating a wife's infidelity as a direct attack on both God's law and social structure. While the death penalty for adultery became uncommon by the 1700s, public humiliation and corporal punishment became the primary tools for enforcing moral conduct. The most infamous of these were the whipping post and the pillory. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties, 1641, technically classified adultery as a capital crime, stating, "If any man shall commit adultery with a married or espoused wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death." In reality, most colonies eventually replaced the death sentence with severe public whippings and prolonged exposure in the pillory. However, women disproportionately received these harsh penalties. Courts were significantly more inclined to prosecute women than men, especially if a resulting pregnancy made the crime undeniable. In colonial towns like Salem, Boston, and Williamsburg, convicted women were stripped to plain clothing, secured to a whipping post, and subjected to as many as 39 lashes across their upper back, often in front of onlookers, clergy, and sometimes their own husbands. Following the flogging, they were confined to the pillory, a wooden device that locked the head and hands, where they stood for hours while passers-by assaulted them with insults, rotten produce, or refuse. This punishment aimed not only to inflict physical pain but to annihilate their reputation, constituting the ultimate form of social death in Puritan society. Women were famously sometimes forced to wear a sewn letter A on their clothing, a real-world practice that predates Nathaniel Hawthorne's fictional The Scarlet Letter, 1850. This branded letter ensured the shame of adultery could never be shed for years. Colonial figures like the diarist Samuel Sewall recorded these sentences without emotion, noting that a woman was whipped for fornication in the presence of many. A grim illustration of how commonplace these spectacles were. These public punishments were intended as much for deterrence as for retribution. The screams, the blood, and the public jeering were all instruments used to enforce moral conformity. In colonial America, the female body became a living slate upon which society inscribed its laws of virtue, one strike at a time. Across centuries and civilizations, the woman's body was made the central battlefield for moral control, scarred, silenced, and sacrificed to uphold patriarchal power. These forms of punishment were not arbitrary cruelties, but deliberate, systemic tools used to enforce social hierarchy and religious doctrine by turning women who dared to defy them into brutal public examples. Which of these historical punishments, the drowning sack, the cleansing fire, the public stoning, or the shaming pillar, do you think had the most lasting social impact on women's rights and reputation, even to this day? And why? Comment below with your thoughts. Let the immense weight of history serve as a grim reminder. When morality is enforced through ritualized pain, justice is always the first casualty. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter on humanity's darkest historical practices.